Part 5 Old Kingdom Ancient Records. Ancient Lives 16 Papyrus is stone letters from a king on arriving at the foot of the Giza Plateau. Most visitors walk up the tarmac road towards the Great Pyramid. And as they walk along that windy, shimmering strip towards the majestic space between the three vast pyramids, they often notice a pair of small and columned doorways standing on a rocky ridge above the Great Pyramid's northwestern corner. Built within the Mastaba cemetery of Khufu's nobles some 2 centuries after those ponderous ranks were first laid out and marked today by a smoothly modern restoration, they are the porticos of 2 tomb chapels, part of the small cemetery of a noble household that had flourished after the age of the kings of Abusir. Those 2 restored doorways lead to the largest and oldest chapels within this little group of tombs, those of their founder, the courtier Sennacherib Inti, and the man who in the tomb chapel's inscriptions is named as his son and successor, Sennacherib Meyi. Apart from the poor quality of the stone, which renders the weathered reliefs somewhat difficult to see, visiting the tomb chapels of Inti and Meyi is much like visiting the remains of dozens of other monuments of average quality in the cemeteries of Giza and Saqqara. What makes these 2 tomb chapels remarkable, however, is a collage of texts that provide a brief biography of Inti and describe something of his work at court. Compiled, the texts inform us, by Inti and Meyi themselves. They include 3 passages whose opening words are literally translated as royal decrees, but in modern translation they may also be described as letters. 3 royal letters concerning the construction of some buildings at the royal residence that were sent to Inti from the offices of the long-lived King Sethe who ruled around 2400 BC. Once more, writing changes everything. Here, it would appear, is the authentic voice of Pharaoh, a voice that in the first half of the letters appears detached, but concludes with flourishes of encouragement. King Sethe appears to have been a man of letters, for another of Inti's texts describes him as writing with his 2 fingers, in order to praise me for everything that I had done. Sethe, indeed, seems to have promoted a literary trend in contemporary court society, for another of his letters written to another courtier, who also carved its words into the walls of the courtyard of his tomb, is entirely concerned with the quality of the courtier's prose. Both memorialized on the stone of a tomb chapel wall or yet surviving on their original papyrus sheets, such letters are very rare, and they are now mostly damaged. Less than 50 such are presently known from the 4-century-long period of the Old Kingdom, and the best part of them are fragments of private correspondences, 30 having been recently discovered in a remote oasis and more in a seaside harbor. Other letters, alternatively, were written to the dead and concerned domestic problems that the departed had bequeathed the living. Can those scanty fragments offer a keyhole through which to view the living state? Or must the tone of their translation and present understanding of the situations of their authors and recipients inevitably misrepresent their tone and content? Found in the 1920s during the excavation of the Step Pyramid's enclosure, this unique Old Kingdom letter seems very blunt in comparison with other surviving pharaonic correspondence and lacks the usual mode of address. Possibly, its tone reflects the urgency with which the state's stoneworking gangs had long addressed their tasks. A graffito of another work gang, for example, prays for a good wind to speed the stone barges. When it was found, the unique letter had been torn in half, the product, so one of its translators has suggested, of the anger of its recipient. Words and writing, though modern translations of these archaic letters appear to mirror forms of speech, it cannot be assumed that they represent the spoken language of their time. Different parts of the pharaonic state, different communities even, may have communicated in different tongues and certainly, as later scribes remark, in a variety of accents, whilst writing of itself occupied a very different place in pharaonic society from that which it does today. Only a tiny percentage of the population of the Lower Nile would have understood the literary syntax that the scribes were still in the processes of creating, a syntax that is likely to have been based upon the formal spoken language of the court. This new-made written language, therefore, was synthetic, a product of a lengthy process in which the archaic repertoire of 1,000 hieroglyphs that had previously been employed to list the constituents of court life names and titles, epithets, year dates and the quantities and categories of supplies and artifacts, was fined down to around 300 signs whilst the functions of those remaining signs were expanded so that they could impart information in linear sequence, that is, in written sentences rather than the standalone data of lists and labels. Best estimates presently suggest that some 10 scribes were at the disposal of every Old Kingdom courtier for whom a tomb chapel was made and that, at any one time, some 10 such tomb chapels were in the process of completion. Such figures would imply that there had been thousands upon thousands of written documents circulating throughout the Old Kingdom court administration, and that the tiny quantities that survive are relics of a vanished mountain of such writings, a mountain whose ghosts appear today in sculptures, paintings and reliefs as images of scrolls held in the hands of scribes, priests and courtiers. This period, therefore, must have been one of extraordinary creativity for the scribes who were still engaged in the centuries-long process of representing sentences, or, more accurately perhaps, of patterns of speech in groups off hieroglyphic signs. As to the tone and texture of those rare surviving texts, those from king to courtier appeared to show a genuine warmth, a relationship conducted with candor and a kind of homeliness, but held within the bounds of a precise propriety. They are the literary equivalents of the relationship between king and subject shown in the Abusir reliefs, a formal yet surprisingly forthright bond contained within a particular relationship that the Egyptologist John Baines has characterized as that of decorum, and which will permeate the courtly air of products of that society down to its ending. Beyond those rare literary expressions there is little evidence of the day-to-day realities of pharaonic government. One can, of course, and this indeed is a popular enough image of that ancient state today, imagine that the officers of the pharaonic court administered the valley of the Lower Nile in the manner of a modern despotic state, that the court had controlled the population by fear and propaganda whilst it enriched itself by brutality and force of arms. That would give Pharaoh's seeming literary warmth something of a crocodile smile. Yet neither the Old Kingdom's spare archaeology nor later literary tales bear out any such assumptions. One might, alternatively, imagine Pharaoh's subjects to have lived in Champollion's Mozartian Orient or a feudal empire ruled by the will of God under a succession of Habsburg-style dynasties. Given our present state of knowledge, however, such speculations are unwise. For there is no firm evidence that Pharaoh's Egypt had labored under any of those highly developed forms of government. Better, then, to take the ancient words and nothing but those words at their face value, but with the understanding that modern translations cannot hope to match contemporary moods. Nor can we even sense the resonances at individual hieroglyphs, those archaic images of living fragments of that courtly world, had added to ancient readings of those same texts. And yet despite all this, some of the surviving texts seem to provide brief glimpses of courtly life in the centuries after the four colossal pyramids were built. Brief lives, the savor of a courtly past, set halfway up the Giza plateau and deep within the tumbledown quarries that lie in drifts of sand behind the Sphinx, the rock-cut tomb and tomb chapel of the courtier Debekni was made in the brief transitional period between the completion of the Giza pyramids and those of the kings of Abusir, that is, between the reigns of Menkaure and Sir, at around 2500 BC. It is an unusually interesting monument, for Debekni's sculptors filled its chambers with a series of innovatory inscriptions and reliefs, not the least of which depicts in lively and quite unexpected detail Debekni's funeral procession, and that, in turn, inspired a procession of scholars from Lepsius down till today to visit this now dark and sooty cave, which until quite recently had been used for the performance of zikrs, hypnotic Sufi prayers performed in unison by groups of men, in honor of a local saint, Sidi Hamd es-Semen, who is said to have once lived within Debekni's pillared halls. In the history of hieroglyphic writing, this tomb holds two great novelties. The first is a list of offerings that was inscribed alongside the images of Debekni's funeral on the west wall of his funerary chapel. This is one of the earliest known examples of a list of the 90 or so provisions and accoutrements that would become the physical components of a ritual that was celebrated at the funerals of kings and courtiers alike down to ancient Egypt's ending. The second literary novelty in Debekni's tomb chapel is a somewhat broken wall text that was carved above a dozen rock-cut sculptures of the man himself, composed in the time of Menkaure, for whom the last and smallest of the three great Giza pyramids was built. It is one of the earliest surviving examples of a type of text which are collectively known as biographies. As for this tomb, Debekni's damaged writings tell the originality and liveliness of both the words and images in Debekni's tomb chapel show a distinct change of tone within the monuments of Giza, a shift away from the spare formalities of the earlier tombs in the massive stone block monuments of the age of Khufu and Prince Hardy at F. As for Debekny's so-called biographic text, similarly lively descriptions of royal donations and the king's various encounters with their courtiers would continue to be composed throughout the following centuries. So, around a decade after Debekny's death, an inscription in the tomb chapel of the courtier Nyingskmet, whose title suggests that he performed a role of healer in the royal court, record how a small Saqqara mastaba made of rough blocks of local stone had been provided with a false door at the command of the pharaoh Sir. A single stone of the finest limestone shipped across the river from the Tural quarries, and standing 10.5 feet high, Nyingskmet's false door is one of the largest to have survived from the times of the Old Kingdom and out of all proportion to the rest of his somewhat humble monument, beautifully engraved with columns of fine hieroglyphs and images of the healer and his wife and children. Parts of its lengthy text tell how such a remarkable object came to be set in such an ordinary tomb. Once again, the text describes the king's personal interest in the central activities of state, that is, in the construction and decoration of stone monuments and, on this occasion, how a courtier's false door had been carved in the royal palace under the daily supervision of the king. Under such circumstances, it is hardly surprising that the text was not voiced, as was Debekny's memoir, as coming from the owner of the tomb, but by a royal scribe, and despite that scribe's description of the making of two false doors, there is only space for one within the tomb. The near contemporary tomb of the courtier Washta had stood close to the mastaba of the court healer, two amongst dozens of such monuments uncovered during the exploration of that great wide sand plain by Mary Ed in the 1850s, when Nyingskmet's splendid false door had been uncovered, dug out and sent off to Cairo in the Khedival Museum. The fate of Washta's mastaba, however, and one shared by several other tomb chapels in that vicinity, was that its limestone walls were dismantled following Mary Ed's excavations in its blocks, collected by antiquities dealers supplying the museums of Europe and America with examples of Old Kingdom craftsmanship, a period that previously had excited scant interest amongst antiquarians. Presently residing in Aberdeen, Cairo, Copenhagen, and London, the blocks of Washta's tomb chapel hold a similarly vivid inscription to those of his one-time neighbor, in this instance a now heavily damaged text describing the dramatic last days of Washta's life. Like some of the text in Inti's tomb at Giza, this inscription, so its opening lines still tell, had been compiled on the orders of his successor as head of household. It was his eldest son who acted for him when he was in his tomb. King Sarah's successor, Neferkar, so the broken narrative continues, had been inspecting progress on his pyramid at Abusir in the company of Washta, when the elderly courtier had suddenly collapsed. Washta was bandaged up and taken to the royal palace, where the king had anxiously sought a cure for his now comatose companion. His Majesty caused a chest of writings to be taken to him concerning the spasms. Then they told His Majesty that he was unconscious, and His Majesty praised Re, but all to no avail. It appears, for snatches of the broken text go on to record how the king ordered a splendid burial for Washta, that 8 alabaster vessels be filled for him and put into a box of ebony, and never the like has been done for anyone since the beginning of time. So the inscription then avers, and His Majesty placed a life-giving amulet onto his nose, and ordered that his body be anointed and prepared for its entombment. Once again, Pharaoh is portrayed as showing care and sympathy towards his close associates, a care that is apparent in several other fragmentary inscriptions, one of which describes how a king ordered a carrying chair to be taken to a sick courtier. At the same time, the straightforward description of royal distress in Washta's inscription injects a firm note of reality into the West's traditional notions of Pharaoh's alleged divinity. For though the king does many things to aid his dying courtier, and despite his direct appeal to his father Re, the scribe carefully records Pharaoh's helplessness and grief in the face of Washta's approaching death. Further intimations of how the pharaohs of these times were regarded by their contemporaries are contained in another memoir of a courtier's encounter with the same king, Neferkar, who had taken such care with Washta. This time, an inscription reports the adventures of a certain Roer, a courtier intimately involved in royal ritual, whose tomb lies in the Giza quarries close to that of Debekni. The occasion of Roer's brush with the royal presence is that of a procession at a water festival. Roer's inscription has often been employed to demonstrate the alleged sacredness of Pharaoh's person. Even the royal staff, so it has been affirmed, held such sacred presence that only the prompt intervention of the king had saved the courtier from a beating after it had touched his foot. More likely, however, is that, just as the author of Washta's text had not invested Pharaoh with the ability to stave off his courtier's approaching death, so Roer is not described as having kicked the sacred staff of a divinity but as simply having impeded the earthly progress of a state procession. Roer's mastaba is a large and straggling monument surrounded, like so many of the courtier's tomb chapels, by the simple graves of the members of his household. Most remarkably, buried in its stony bulk, it had no less than 25 closed rooms of a type especially designed for storing statues. Known today as serdabs, these sculpture rooms have no doors, just narrow slits within their walls so that the eyes of the statues that were entombed within them could stare outwards, and Roer's mortuary priests could make offerings directly to them. Most of the courtiers' mastabas of Roer's time usually held one or two serdabs in them, each one of which would have held but a few statues. Roer's tomb chapel, however, had more than 100 statues walled up in those serdabs, most of which were set around a central pillared hall. Though lime burners had destroyed the best part of the mastaba, when the archaeologist Salim Hassan excavated its remains in the 1930s, he found many splendid fragments of alabaster, limestone and granite statues and some beautiful wall reliefs in its remains. Here, then, would appear to be a personal preference at work, another individual aspect of a courtier other than written text preserved within the architecture of his tomb. That several of Roer's serdabs had had steps before them, and slits high up in their walls to light their dark interiors suggests a practical desire on behalf of the tomb's designers, and, presumably, Roer as well, to enable his multitude of images to be viewed by living people. Unlike Roer's splendid images, however, the so-called biographic texts seldom provide rounded portraits of the owners of the tombs in which they were engraved. Even in such tombs as Roer's and Debekni's, where the biographic texts were placed close to statues of Thadom's owners, the block holding Roer's inscription having been found lying in one of his serdabs, they appear to have served as captions to the tomb chapel images in the same way that many of the activities shown in the reliefs are described in written titles, like the contemporary scenes of court life that were engraved within the temples. At Abusir, what essentially these and later biographic texts describe is an event or a sequence of events which epitomize aspects of the relationship of the tomb owner to the living monarch, their personal relationship to the man upon the throne. Our great good fortune is that these lively documents survive from a world that is otherwise entirely lost, and that they suggest alternatives to those traditional explanations of life and belief at the court of the Abusir kings, which describe the manners and modes of being at that court too, have been credulous and brutal. What, in reality, their surviving texts, their relics and their architecture show is that Pharaoh's courtiers and subjects had remarkable sensitivities and an impressive measure of those qualities that the anthropologist Gananath Basker has described as practical rationality - the ability to make reflective reasoned judgments. Like all the peoples of the world, those of the Memphite kingdom were constrained by our common biological inheritance, yet at the same time their culture was self-contained and self-constructed and the product of a unique environment. The difference, therefore, is one of understanding, for this was a culture whose rationale and mode of being was different from any in the modern world. 17. Writing in the pyramids. After Abusir, A History in Pyramids. At around 2400 BC, the royal workforce moved south again from Abusir into the ancient burial grounds of Saqqara, and there they made pyramids and temples for several kings within that desert and, presumably, set new palaces and settlements upon the plains below. Sethe, the letter-writing pharaoh, had been the first to move. Known locally today as the Haram al-Shalaf, the Pyramid of the Watchman. His ruined tomb stands on a spur of desert limestone some 3 miles to the south of Abusir and close to Shepsesk's colossal mastaba, at the site generally known as South Saqqara. Venus and Sethe, alternatively. The two succeeding kings set their pyramids a little to the north, in the center of the old Saqqara cemeteries near the Pyramid of Usur-Kaf and close to the ancient rectangle of the step pyramid's enclosure walls. Despite these relocations, the external architecture and dimensions of these later pyramids stayed much the same as those of Abusir. Now, though, the pyramid's interior apartments were further standardized, and those of Sethe were adopted as the single architectural design of the interiors of all of the following major pyramids of the late Old Kingdom. After Sethe, therefore, the dead king's journey to the darkness of their burial chambers began on the sunlit pavements of their pyramid's northern face, where a square-sectioned doorway angled sharply down through the living rock towards a point beneath the apex of the pyramid, just a yard in height and, in Sethe's pyramid, lined with smoothly polished blocks of Aswan granite. These awkward corridors ran straight down for almost 100 feet before leveling out and opening into a narrow chamber. Then after passing through a second chamber with 3 great granite portcullises, the corridors entered a square room with a gabled roof, beautifully made of large blocks of the whitest limestone. These are the so-called antechambers. Here, the straight line of the entrance passageway divides, turning at right angles to the east. The corridors lead to 3 small stone chambers, similar in proportion to others in the earlier pyramids, and also to the little chambers by the central shrines of royal shrines and temples. These rooms, therefore, may have held statues, ritual equipment, or served as stores for offerings. Angling to the west, alternatively, the entrance passages pass through other low stone doorways that give access to the burial chambers. And at the far end of those narrow rooms, beneath splendid gabled roofs, were set the royal sarcophagi, cut from hard desert stone and of impressive dimensions. These could only have been set in their positions before the chamber's massive roofing blocks, more than a dozen of them above each chamber, were slid into position. Here it was that the royal burial parties, which in such constrained environments could have hardly amounted to the Baroque processions of popular imagination, had concluded the rites of the king's interment before scrambling back up the tiny entrance passageways towards the light, blocking the way behind them by lowering the 3 portcullises and, finally, paving over the entrances within the open courts. Constricted, pressured, hot and muffled and acoustic, these unearthly subterranean environments would serve as inspiration for the architecture of all later royal tombs. This of itself would be of but limited historical interest were it not for the fact that the interiors of the pyramids built by Sethe's successors, those of Venus and of Sethe, Pepi I, Mariner and Pepi II, and of the smaller pyramids of several queens, had vertical columns of hieroglyphs engraved upon their limestone walls. Today, these various inscriptions are known generically as the pyramid texts. In their day, they had been part of that historic transformation in which written texts were reproduced as monumental inscriptions. The reproduction, for example, in courtly hieroglyphs of letters such as those of King Sethe's on the walls of tomb chapels or of the so-called biographic Texts of nobles such as Debekni and Washta. The texts within the pyramids, however, are of a different order from those within the courtiers' monuments, and their influence both inside and outside the pharaonic state has been long-lasting and profound. Presently, the earliest known examples of these pyramid texts are those cut into the walls of the burial chamber and antechamber of the Pyramid of Venus in central Saqqara. Later pyramids, however, have far more texts engraved within them, and their contents are often different from earlier examples. Their locations too within the pyramids were gradually extended, until they came to cover the best part of the interior rooms and corridors. As a corpus of inscriptions, the pyramid texts comprise more than 900 separate verses, at least 330 of which continued to be used in funerary settings all along the lower Nile down to the ending of pharaonic culture, carved in a clear and workmanlike manner. Though cast in archaic and frequently impenetrable prose, they are the foundations of all later pharaonic texts that describe the rites of funeral and the destinies of death. 10 pyramids are presently known to have held pyramid texts within them. 8, including those in the pyramids of Pepi I, Merenner and Pepi II, are set close by the pyramid of King Isesi at South Saqqara and are ruined, many of the pyramids so robbed of stone that several of their burial chambers had lain open to the sky. Though similarly despoiled, 4 smaller, simpler and steeper-sided structures, some of the queen's pyramids at South Saqqara, also had pyramid texts engraved within them, as does another ruined pyramid nearby, built after the ending of the Old Kingdom for an obscure king named Ebi, set on bedrock on either side of a small sandy valley above a rolling sea of silver palms. The considerable cluster of the South Saqqara pyramids was set apart from the rest of the Saqqara cemeteries, as well as the curious mastaba of King Shepseskir. South Saqqara also holds the royal pyramids accompanying temples, whose architectures and wall reliefs were but modest variations of the same arrangements as those at Abusir. Unknown numbers of courtiers' tombs also lie amidst the South Saqqara pyramids, along with the smaller graves of members of their households, though, like the monuments of Abusir, the greater part of this enormous congregation lost much of its stone to the limekilns of the monastery of Appa Jeremiah and other later builders. Nonetheless, the present mass of wind-blown sand and ruined monuments is one of ancient Egypt's greatest burying grounds, its future promise held in the scattered lines of half-buried walls and heaps of fine white limestone that lie within its yellow drifts. In the year 2000, a previously unknown Queen's Pyramid was brought to light at South Saqqara with another set of pyramid texts inscribed upon its burial chamber walls. Although the best part of the limestone blocks on which the South Saqqara pyramid texts had been inscribed are shattered, the fragments that survive are usually in good condition, having been preserved within the sand and rubble of their ruined pyramids. From the first days of their discovery, therefore, their fragmentary condition, the different versions of their verses that are found in various pyramids, and their sheer literary ambiguity presented a perfect academic puzzle. Into the crypt. The first fragments of the pyramid text to be uncovered in modern times were found amidst the ruins of some of the South Saqqara pyramids that were so devastated that Mariette had taken them to be fragments of relief from plundered mastabas. In the following year, however, in 1881, the opening of Venus Pyramid, some of whose pristine interior walls were covered in 900 lengthy columns of fine-made hieroglyphs, had confirmed the dawning recognition that, after Abusir, the Old Kingdom pyramids had texts engraved within them. In their perfection, the texts in Venus Modest Pyramid appeared to come from nowhere, for there is not the slightest trace of any writing on the interior walls of any earlier pyramid. And yet there had been precedents for the craftsmen who had made the burial apartments for several of the courtiers of kings before the reign of Venus had already broken with all previous custom and set short texts upon their walls. In Antechamber to the burial chamber of Sennacherib Inti, for example, the recipient of some of King Isaisi's letters, holds a list of offerings drawn in a watery black wash with a wide soft brush upon a specially prepared panel of white plaster. Like the other early examples in such tomb text, these lists are similar to those in the tomb chapels above. In the darkness of those burial apartments, however, the draftsman's technique is freer and far livelier. When Reisner's excavators had first entered the plundered burial chamber of Sennacherib Inti in November 1913, they found the courtier himself still lying in a heavy grey granite sarcophagus emblazoned with his name. Though robbed, it had never been a rich interment but rather one of grand simplicity, the carefully mummified corpse of an aged man, lying on its back accompanied by jars of imported ointments and a single splendid staff, a visible sign, perhaps, of Sennacherib Inti's role at court. Little more than roughly quarried caverns, the poor and usually fractured desert rock in which such funerary crypts were cut had to be especially prepared before any text could have been set within them. And it became common practice during the following reigns to either smooth those rough rock surfaces entirely or to erect whole walls of stone or mud brick within them so that some form of decoration could be applied. The texts placed in the interior of Venus Pyramid, therefore, were quite in keeping with these courtly trends, though with the resources of the entire state machine behind them they were on a grander scale and more complex than any earlier examples. Like the entrance to King Isaisi's near contemporary pyramid, the corridor leading into Sennacherib Inti's burial chamber runs straight down into the living rock, this passageway of itself being something of an innovation as the burial chambers of most earlier nobles' tombs had been set at the bottom of vertical shafts. The subterranean text, the list of offerings, had been painted on the wall of a small antechamber, through which the entrance corridor passes on its way down to the burial crypt, squared and quartered in the manner of the Abusir. Accounting papyri, it is a common list, parts of that same offering register having already been inscribed upon the walls of Debekni's tomb chapel, whilst yet earlier shorter examples are amongst the oldest known forms of hieroglyphic text. The damaged list of offerings in Inti's burial apartments held all that a member of the court would have required to keep him in the manner in which he had lived, everything from clothes and water to ointments and I paint in a marvelous array of food, some 18 types of seeds and flour, breads plain and toasted, a lengthy and meticulously differentiated list of domestic and wild birds, various cuts of meat both raw and cooked, and quantities of onions which, as their modern vendors in that same region rightly claim, would have been as sweet as honey. A capacious hamper for the afterlife complete with wine and fruit, and one of which various versions appear within the pyramid texts, from their first appearance in King Venus' burial chamber down to the Old Kingdom's ending. Such offering lists had long since been inscribed in the courtier's tomb chapels, and fragmentary versions of those same lists had also been inscribed on the walls of the royal temples of Abusir and later, too, in those of South Saqqara, where they are shown as lists of offerings presented to the living king. The same offerings, therefore, were presented to the living and the dead. In the temples, however, these lists are often accompanied by images of officiating priests holding rolls of papyrus. Like the letters in the courtiers' tombs, it would appear that these monumental lists had also been copied out from scrolls. In this instance, however, the written scrolls had not held the words of letters or biography, but those that the priests had read out during the rites of offering, for numerous verses of the pyramid text including those of their offering lists are topped and tailed by such introductory and concluding phrases as recitation and end of section, just as the move to decorate burial chambers had been underway decades before its first appearance in King Venus' pyramid. So, too, the form that the calligraphic texts of the papyrus rolls would take in their monumental hieroglyphic versions had already been formalized. The letters inscribed in Inti's tomb chapel, for example, those that had been sent by Wena's predecessor, King Sethe, had been engraved around the doorway of his tomb chapel in long vertical columns in a manner similar to the text sculpted in the later pyramids. And in much the same fashion, the memoirs inscribed in the tomb chapels of Debekni, Rohr, and Rashepses were also set in vertical columns. So when Wenas came to the throne, the sudden majestic appearance of hundreds upon hundreds of lines of column text inside his pyramid had modest if practical precedent, one that in typical pharaonic fashion also had a practical explanation. For Wenas' pyramid, which is the smallest of the Old Kingdom's royal pyramids, had been built at the center of a very crowded cemetery. The pavement slabs of its pyramid temple, indeed, had overlaid the underground apartments of the tomb of an archaic king. There was little room, therefore, in that cramped environment for any architectural additions once the pyramid and its adjacent temple had been built. Yet Wenas appears to have ruled for several decades, and that, as would often be the case with other lengthy reigns, provided an ample opportunity for the court machine, with its ongoing processes of offering and manufacture, to elaborate and enlarge the original conception of such royal monuments. At almost half a mile, the causeway running down from Wenas' pyramid was nearly as long as that of the Great Pyramid, and on its way down through the cemeteries to the desert's edge a series of high well-built embankments had bridged some ancient quarries and had overlaid many earlier tombs, burying them in their pristine state until their excavation in the 1960s. Before the lime burners destroyed the better part of them, the causeway's walls had held a remarkable series of reliefs, with an innovatory range of subject matter, one unique surviving scene depicting celebrations following the placing of the capstone upon the royal pyramid, proves it to be a late addition to Wenas' other monuments. In similar fashion, two long narrow pits such as had not been made for generations were cut into the rock by the sides of the causeways. Embankments, pits similar in size and form to those beside the Great Pyramid of Giza, in which the disassembled planks of King Khufu's boats were placed at the time of the royal funeral. And at the far end of this great long causeway and in an equally sumptuous fashion, the architecture of a now badly ruined temple had been continually elaborated so that, in its final form, it had been as grand as any of those at Abusir. Set close to the desert's edge in an archaic canal, it is likely that this valley temple had stood near Wenas' palace and its associated settlements. Here, then, building over decades in somewhat straitened circumstances, the architecture of the royal funerary arrangements, which had been developed over centuries, was brought to its maturity. Of all those elaborations and innovations, however, to modernize the most remarkable are the texts that were cut in columns on the walls inside Wenas' pyramid itself. The voice inside the pyramid. The pyramid texts are generally regarded as rhetorical writings, for they are said in the present tense and their voice appears to be lively and authoritative. Nor was this mode of writing in itself an innovation. By the time of their first appearance in the Pyramid of Wenas, commands and exclamations and even the words of little songs had long since been inscribed above many of the scenes on tomb chapel and temple walls. In common with most speech patterns, the pyramid text 900-odd verses are seldom more than a few hundred words long, and most are shorter. None of them, however, offer any explanation, any doctrine or dogma, nor are they parts of a continuous narrative. To the modern world, this seeming lack of purpose combined with the frequently impenetrable prose may well appear deliberately obtuse, mysterious or even mystical. Yet in their contemporary context it is not surprising, for the core of the ancient culture of the Lower Nile was never contained within its written texts. This, after all, was a society that in the centuries before those texts appeared had already built colossal pyramids and temples and whose courtiers and scribes had managed Those vast enterprises with skill and energy but without a word of written explanation. Down to its ending, pharaonic Egypt was ordered by visual intelligence and found its most profound and typical expressions in making and moving things. For the modern Western world, alternatively, whose culture is founded on the written word and whose visions of ancient Egypt were based upon Champollion's literary researches, the sudden discovery of text within the pyramids promised revelations. They held out not only the possibility of a written explanation of the beliefs of those who had planned and built the fabled pyramids of Egypt, but also the promise of a literary pedigree for a culture whose origins stretch back beyond those pyramids into deep prehistory. So it is hardly surprising that, following their abrupt rediscovery in the 1880s, the study of the pyramid texts became one of Egyptology's largest ongoing projects, one that has provided and continues to provide a greater understanding of ancient Egyptian grammar and has given new depth and quality to the understanding and translation of the ancient texts. Yet like the work of Champollion and his successors, this second vital phase in the decipherment of ancient Egyptian history was shaped by contemporary European circumstance. 18. The Dead and the Quick. 1880 AD – The pyramid texts discovered. As with many archaeological discoveries, the first pyramid texts to be seen in modern times were uncovered in excavations undertaken to fill the cases of museums, in this instance, a new Khedival Museum of Antiquities in Cairo. By 1880, when the first of those texts were found, Mariette Pasha, the museum's founder, designer and director, had excavated sites all up and down the lower Nile for a quarter of a century, using thousands of peasant farmers working en corvée to free the country's greatest tombs and temples from the sands and buildings that had come to fill them. These had been the glory years of the recovery of pharaonic culture, if not for the hapless farmers who were driven to undertake those works. And in the process of those labors, Mariette had recovered many of ancient Egypt's best-known relics. By 1880, he was keen to display those treasures in the order of pharaonic history in a new museum. But cash was short. In an ambitious drive for modernization, the Khedive Ismail, Egypt's ruler, had built up enormous debts to European banks so that, during the decades of Mariette's excavations, their repayments had resulted in pitiless systems of taxation that had brought famine to the rural population, forced the sale in 1875 of the Suez Canal to the British government, and triggered the imposition of a so-called European ministry, with English and French officials working in Cairo. So Mariette, who had planned to fill some of the historical gaps in his collection during the first months of 1880 by undertaking further excavations, was forced to concentrate his excavations at just 2 locations, 40 laborers being put to work beside the temples at the Giza Sphinx where, at the beginning of his work in Egypt, he had found the famous statue of Khafra, whilst just 20 men and boys were saying to dig into the gentle hills of South Saqqara, a site that his work gangs had briefly touched in earlier years, but whose stone-studded sands had always promised further treasures. In late February 1880, Mariette visited the South Saqqara excavations, which were proceeding under Rais, that is, Chief or Headman Ruby Hamzoy, with whom the ebullient Frenchman had worked side by side since his first days in Egypt. Part of Rais Ruby's excavations had entailed digging into a hill of sand and loose stone blocks where, at its center, the work gangs had uncovered slabs of fine white limestone bearing vertical columns of blue-painted hieroglyphs containing the cartouches of Pepi. 2. Knowing full well the rarity of lengthy Old Kingdom inscriptions, Mariette had paper squeezes taken from those stones. This was a fairly disastrous process in which sheets of heavy handmade paper soaked in water were pressed against the surface of an engraved stone whilst a stippling brush was banged against the soggy sheet so that, after it had dried, the stiffened card would hold a reproduction, in negative, of the original. a copy often decorated with traces of detached ancient pigment. In late spring of that same year, as Cairo started to warm up to its torrid summer, Mariette, a longtime sufferer from diabetes and in increasingly poor health, had sailed for France. At Paris, he showed his South Saqqara squeezes to Gaston Maspero, his one-time protégé but by that time a brilliant young professor of Egyptian philology at the Collège de France and the author of a recent groundbreaking history of the ancient Orient. Maspero later said that he had immediately understood that the text of Mariette's squeezes had come from the burial chamber of a royal pyramid. Mariette, alternatively, had thought that they were from the chapel of a courtier's tomb, for he had found many a king's cartouche engraved in tomb chapels but not a single hieroglyph upon the walls of royal pyramids. After meeting Maspero in Paris, Mariette took himself to a tiny mountain spa in central France, but his health did not improve and he became increasingly depressed. In Cairo at that same time, an international committee of liquidation consisting of 4 European bureaucrats was imposed on the Egyptian government expressly to control the nation's finances and so enable the repayment of the national debt to foreign banks. Within the month, the committee's British representative, an old India hand and a member of a prominent German banking family, one Captain Evelyn Baring, later Lord Cromer, had proposed a savage list of reforms. There would be further cuts to education, to the army and the civil service, whilst the levels of taxation that had caused famine and unrest over the past few years would not be relaxed. By October, and after visiting his hometown of Boulogne-sur-Mer, Mariette had decided to return to Egypt, for he felt that he was dying. And he wrote to his old friend, the German Egyptologist Heinrich Brugsch, an extraordinary and prodigious scholar who had worked with Mariette since the beginning of his excavations, asking him to come again to Egypt. After a month-long voyage, Mariette arrived in Alexandria, hemorrhaging profusely. As soon as he reached Cairo, Emil Brugsch, the brother of Heinrich and a curator at the new museum, set up a couch for Mariette outside his family's apartment, on the museum's open porch. Back in Paris, the word was out that Mariette was mortally ill. Who, then, would take up his central role in the cultural affairs of Egypt, a role that France had held since Napoleon's Grand Tour of the East? The man addressed in this epistolary call to arms was Professor Maspero. The writer, one Arthur Rohn, a friend of Maspero's and an official of the French government, where the possibility of the situation arising had long since been discussed. The Baron de Ring, the French consul general in Egypt, had already proposed that the role which Mariette had forged for himself within the administration of Egypt's antiquities, an organization for the collection and protection of antiquities, should be formalized by the controlling European powers and that a French institute should be established in Cairo along the lines that Baron Bunsen had defined for the Prussian Institutes of Archaeology in Rome and Athens. Maspero rose promptly to the challenge. On November 13, 1880, the Baron de Ring appointed him head of a mission of French archaeologists to Egypt and officially requested him to establish an Institute of Oriental Archaeology in Cairo. Even as Maspero had packed for Cairo, a French government decree had ratified the Baron's proposals and granted funds for their support. Brugsch Bey, meanwhile, had abandoned the chair of Egyptology at Göttingen University and reached Cairo before his dying friend. And as they sat together on the museum's wooden porch, Mariette asked him to inspect the South Saqqara excavations, where Rais Ruby had uncovered 2 more sets of texts similar to those from which Mariette had made the squeezes that he had shown to Maspero in Cairo. All those texts, Rais Ruby had since told Mariette, lay at the centers of destroyed pyramids. So Brugsch Bey and his brother took the train to Memphis and rode donkeys up into the sandhills of South Saqqara, where they found that Mariette's workforce had been augmented by the Giza teams and that they were working side by side. Here, Then, the brothers found that, as Rais Ruby had described, there were the ruins of no less than 3 royal pyramids, which had been so denuded by stone robbers that their interiors lay exposed in part open to the sky. These, Bruges, recognized from the inscribed cartouches in their inscriptions, had been the burial chambers of Pepi I and Pepi II and that of the intermediary ruler Mariner. The texts, however, were now dangerously located. The entrance corridors had partially collapsed, whilst following the excavation of their sand and rubble filling some of the great blocks of the burial chambers. Broken roofs hung unsupported. And as in many desert excavations, there was an ever-present danger of sudden burial in soft flowing sand. Eoi donc, malgré tout, des pyramides écrites, je n'y l'aurais jamais cru. Mariette is famously reported to have said on hearing Bruges' report that same evening, there are then, in spite of everything, writings in the pyramids, I would not have believed it. The next day, the 2 brothers returned to South Saqqara and scrambled through the ruined pyramids once more to check the copies of the text that they had made the day before. The mummy of a young man, eviscerated, embalmed and wrapped in fine linen, the skin well preserved, the outlines of the features distinct, eyes closed, nose fallen. And, quite possibly the king himself, but probably a later and intrusive burial, had been dug out of Mariner's ruined burial chamber. Right away, the brothers decided to take this strange package to the bedside of Mariette so that he might gaze at last upon the face of Pharaoh. And as they carried the burial cadaver down from the pyramids to the local railway station, they met Charles Wilbur, an American student of Professor Maspero, a lively diarist on his way to view Mariette's South Saqqara excavations. Wilbur describes the brothers' Bruges as covered in dust, their trousers ripped, their knees bloodied, with one of them at the mummy's head, the other at its feet. Later in its journey up to Cairo, Bruges Bey recalled, it had broken into 2. Mariette, he tells, was not delighted with their dusty offering. It was his last coherent conversation with his friend, accompanied by 3 students, a draftsman and a publicist. Maspero had arrived in Cairo 2 days later, on January 7, 1881, and the following day the International Cairo Press, at that time the city long since called the Klondike on the Nile, had more than 100,000 European residents and several foreign-language newspapers, announced the founding of a new French institute in Egypt. On paying a visit to his old professor, whom Wilbur found supervising the unpacking of his library and his household goods, Maspero told him that he was astonished to be sent to Cairo and thought that Mariette might live for years. He then asked the American, somewhat nervously, about Bruges Bey's activities. And all this whilst lines of people were yet visiting the dying Mariette. From the workmen, the sailors and the race who had worked on his vast excavations to ministers of the Egyptian government, the Baron de Ring, and hosts of consuls and ambassadors. At that same time, Egypt was herself in agony. 2 years before, a famine brought on by low Niles and high taxation had killed an estimated 700,000 of the rural population. At Dendera in Upper Egypt, it was said that a cook's tour boat had fed 1,000 starving people with loaves baked in the steamers' kitchens. In Cairo and Alexandria, several nationalist groups were inspired by the aim of wresting Egypt's governance from foreign rulers, backed by the regiments of Egypt's army. The most prominent of these movements, the Free National Party, Al-Hizb al-Watani el-Hur, had as its most vocal leader Colonel Ahmad Arabi, who was alternatively arrested, threatened with execution and assassination, and appointed as Minister of War. Both London and Paris became increasingly alarmed at the developing situation that threatened both the servicing of Egypt's debt and control of the Suez Canal, which was the route to British India and the Far East. On January 12, 1881, just a few days after Maspero's arrival in Egypt, the governments of Britain and France had sent a joint note to the Egyptian government backing the Khedive and threatening military intervention should the status quo be threatened. Thus the die was cast. That, within 2 years, saw a devastating bombardment of Alexandria by a British fleet, the military defeat and subsequent exile of Ahmad Arabi, and the establishment of the so-called Veiled Protectorate by which Britain would rule Egypt de facto until the 1950s. Mariette died at his museum 6 days after the delivery of the joint note to the Egyptian parliament, and his funeral was held the following day. The diary of one of Maspero's accompanying students, the 22-year-old Victor Lauret, describes the scene at Bulak, which at that time was a Nile-side Cairo suburb but now lies at the center of the modern city. Ultimately, however, Mariette was placed, suitably enough, in a granite sarcophagus of pharaonic style but European manufacture in the gardens of the present Cairo Museum, which he would never see but which, essentially, his energies had stocked and founded, the first national museum of antiquities outside of Europe. Mariette had wanted Baruch Spey to succeed him in his post of director of Egyptian antiquities and had called him to Cairo expressly for that purpose. Egypt, however, had greatly changed since the days when he and his friend had first excavated at Saqqara, and the Baron de Ring had moved swiftly amongst the international committees and the ministers of the Khedival government to ensure that Maspero would take charge of Egypt's antiquities. So at Mariette's funeral Baruch walked behind the coffin disappointed and alone, separated from all the other foreigners. In the following days, French government funds paid for the ongoing excavations at South Saqqara. Mariette's papers and library were purchased for France, his debts were settled, for he was never rich, and his 2 beloved daughters, who had been left penniless in Cairo, were given passage back to Paris. So hastily were those arrangements executed that Mariette's inventory of the antiquities in the new Khedival Museum was shipped to France in air and had to be returned. In those same days, Arabi's regiments marched on Cairo and sacked the law courts and some government ministries. Then, following the protests of the Khediva and at the behest of Captain Baring, the British commissioner, the Baron de Ring, who had taken the part of Arabi's rebellious officers, was recalled to France and later sent as minister to the Ottoman court in Constantinople. Meanwhile, the Saqqara excavations, which had been refinanced with funds from France and the offices of Cook's Tours, were extended to include the ruins of the pyramids of central Saqqara where, on February 28, 1881, the interior of Venus Pyramid with its near-perfect set of pyramid texts was opened for the first time in the modern era. A month later, the nearby pyramid of Venus' successor, Teti, was also entered and that, too, was found to hold similar texts upon its walls. Even as Mariette's old race had been opening Teti's ruined pyramid, Maspero, along with his wife and staff and several French government agents, took a tour of inspection down the Nile in Mariette's old steam boat, the Menkié. One of his prime objectives on that triumphant voyage was the location of an unknown tomb or tombs that for a decade and more have been supplying the museums of the West with fine papyri and other splendid funerary objects. At Luxor, where, 2 years before, some of the children of the town had been kept alive with daily rations of fresh milk from the tourist boats, the local police arrested 3 brothers of a prominent local family, the Abusir Rasul, who after months of threat and torture revealed the location of a cache of mummies that included those of many famed Egyptian pharaohs. By that time, however, Maspero had already returned to France, and so it fell to Emile Baruch and Ahmed Kamal Bey, one of the few trained Egyptologists of the day, employed at the new museum as a secretary, to empty that most remarkable of funerary crypts. And all of those extraordinary finds, the pyramid texts, the royal mummies, were hailed in the European press as masterstrokes of Professor Maspero and his new administration. With the aid of Egypt's British rulers, the affable Parisian professor would dominate the control of Egypt's antiquities with such success that In 1909 he received an honorary knighthood from the British Crown. From his offices at the museum he oversaw the government's publications of the national collections and shaped their presentation in a new national museum. At the same time, as the director of the Service des Antiquités, Maspero also granted permits for all excavations within Egypt and supervised the distribution of their finds between their excavators, who were mostly foreign patrons, in the National Museum. The directorate was held by Maspero and successive French scholars until the Egyptian Revolution of 1956. So for some 70 years. Throughout a fundamental period of ancient Egypt's excavation and interpretation, the processes of recovering pharaonic monuments and relics were guided by the requirements, the demands and social attitudes of contemporary European academics and international museums, by foreign nationalisms and high finance, influences that cast enormous shadows over ancient Egyptian history down to this day. Stone to paper, from Saqqara to Berlin, even as Maspero was taking his first trip up the Nile in the Menkié, a young Englishman took a day off from surveying the Great Pyramid to walk across the desert to the excavations at South Saqqara, where, at the behest of Dr. Birch of the British Museum, he climbed down through the broken roof of Papyrus burial chamber and recopied some of the text, which Brugsch Bey and his brother had copied down a week before. And so it was that William Matthew Flinders Petrie, that most gifted of contemporary archaeologists, on his first trip to Egypt enabled an anonymous correspondent writing in the April edition of the Athenaeum magazine to release the first public news of the discovery of the pyramid texts. 2 months later, an article jointly written by Birch and Brugsch Bey, containing transcriptions and translations of those same texts, was published in the Proceedings of the Society for Biblical Archaeology, a leading Egyptological journal of the day, to which Professor Maspero had also sent many contributions, though full of difficulties, as its authors readily acknowledged. It was already recognized that these most ancient texts from Egypt's pyramids could hold fresh chapters of human history and religious revelations in the prospect of establishing a relationship between the world's most ancient religious writings and those of the Old Testament. The 2 British articles vexed the French establishment. In earlier times, precedence of publication had been a matter of courtesy between interested gentlemen. Now such issues had assumed political and professional dimensions. Though trifling and inaccurate, their appearance had stolen the public moment of the revelation of the world's most ancient religious writings, leaving Maspero to publish sections of the 4,000 then known columns of pyramid texts over the following decade until, in 1894, his full edition of Les Inscriptions des Pyramides de Saqqara finally appeared. A copious and lively writer from the days of his youth, Maspero's celebrated History of the Ancient Orient, which first appeared in 1875, had become a standard text of historians and Bible scholars alike, and indeed had first brought the professor to the attention of the Baron de Ring, though a latecomer to that celebrated Parisian circle of linguistic scholarship which had already drawn Champollion, Bunsen, Lepsius and many others to that liveliest of cities. Maspero was already a luminary of the Collège de France. Not surprisingly, therefore, after an initial 6-year stint in Cairo, he left his various Egyptian projects in the hands of his students and returned to Paris in the Collège de France. And there it was, in 1895, that he first met a precocious 16-year-old named Alan Gardner, just out of Charterhouse, whose father, a silk merchant and city banker, had sent his young son off to Paris at the lad's request to study at the Collège de France, as Gardner later recalled. Even as a boy nearing the end of his school days, I was fired with the desire to become an Egyptologist. One fine Parisian morning, after suffering the elaborate French of one of Maspero's lectures on a single verse of the text within the pyramids, Gardner had asked the good professor, who had just published his full edition of those elusive documents, what, exactly, was its meaning. I have a lot of imagination, you know. Maspero had replied. I think the explanation I gave you just now was very good, but I assure you that I could have given you 20 explanations equally good. To young Gardner, who would always strive for clarity and had already come to the opinion that Maspero was an unsound grammarian, such Gallic self-assurance seemed utterly unwarranted, and thereupon he ceased to attend the great man's lectures. In later years, however, Sir Alan Gardner, arguably the greatest Egyptologist England has produced, reluctantly came to a similar conclusion concerning ancient Egyptian religious texts, which underlines the fact that, from the days of their discovery, the pyramid texts, the most ambiguous, the most archaic of all Egyptian literature, had presented Egyptologists with especial difficulties of understanding. Even as Maspero was lecturing in Paris, however, a group of Berlin-based philologists, part of a century-old school of research whose ambition, described by one of its most illustrious students as the conquest of the ancient world by scholarship was revolutionizing the study of ancient Egypt and its hieroglyphs, its religion and its history. So it was that in 1902, a year after graduating from Oxford University, Gardner traveled to Berlin and stayed in that city for 12 years of study, buying a house, building a library and starting a family, and all the while contributing to the task of creating a great grand hieroglyphic dictionary whose ultimate aim was to include all known occurrences of the words of all known hieroglyphic texts. That work brought Gardner into daily contact with Professor Adolf Erman, the founder of the so-called Berlin School of Egyptology and also of its hieroglyphic dictionary. Of the same generation as Maspero, Erman was a son and grandson of eminent Berlin academics, who in their turn were descendants of a charmed circle of humanists and intellectuals who had founded a university in Berlin at the turn of the 18th century, and had made that institution the most influential center of learning in the world. And the continuing studies and researches in that university have had a greater influence upon modern views of ancient Egypt than have the works of Jean-François Champollion. Studiosus Philologiae – The Conquest of the Past. The fundamental revolution in the modern understanding of ancient Egypt has its origins in the pretty town of Göttingen, south of Berlin, where George II of England, Duke of Brunswick and Prince-Elector of Hanover, had established a university from which, in 1777, Friedrich August Wolff had matriculated after enrolling, so it was said, as a Studiosus Philologiae – as a student of philology, as a student, that is, of a university department which at that time did not exist within the Western world. Of itself, of course, the study of exotic literature and ancient written records was hardly new, as a means for the better interpretation of both the Bible and the law. That study had run wide and deep throughout the courts and monasteries of post-Renaissance Europe. Winckelmann's view of ancient Greek culture as the epitome of human society, however, had shifted the focus of that traditional scholarship and, like most educated Europeans of his time, Wolff, who was Winckelmann's biographer, was also a disciple at Göttingen, therefore, at that most liberal of 18th century universities, Wolff began employing philologies, traditional tools not to further aid in understanding of the writings of the Church, but in an attempt to recover something of the lost reality of pagan ancient Greece. At the beginning of those investigations, Wolff had undertaken an analysis of the language of what was considered to be the noblest and the oldest of all Greek texts, the Iliad and the Odyssey, a study that hadled him to the conclusion, revolutionary for those times, that the two venerable works had not been written by a single poet but were compilations of the works of several different authors. Until that time, such ancient texts had simply been regarded as the prime source of ancient history. Wolff's groundbreaking philological analysis, however, had shown that classical literature of itself could reveal a previously unknown history, an intellectual history, in an entirely new dimension of the past. Its retrieval, though, would clearly be a massive task, for if all of classical literature was to be subjected to such close analysis, entire schools of specially trained philologists would be required. And that in turn led Wolff to reinvent the seminar, originally a medieval form of study, in which groups of students gathered under the guidance of a professor to conduct original research. Throughout the 19th century, the sciences of linguistics and textual criticism were developed in German universities, in both classical and biblical scholarship were taking on entirely different paths from anything before, a process that had extraordinary impact in academia and caused enormous division and disruption within the European churches. A further consequence of this revolution in the world of learning was that the University of Göttingen became a center of the new language studies in a biblical, Sanskrit and classical literature. In 1867, before he was called to Cairo to run a short-lived medieval school of Egyptology, Brugschbey had occupied a new-made chair of Egyptology at that university, and by the 1870s chairs of Egyptology were being established in the universities of Leipzig, Berlin, and Paris. In the academic discipline itself, the study, that is, of ancient Egyptian language, had begun to find its professional academic base. At the same time, a revision of the nature of history itself was also underway, a revision that had also been prompted by the growth in the study of philology and an accompanying re-evaluation of the role of original documents rather than the continual reuse of old and ancient historical commentaries. Concurrently, the increasing use of the seminar as a tool of learning had led to the invention of such brand new academic disciplines as sociology, anthropology, ethnography, linguistics, and the history of art, that these various new-founded disciplines were developing at the same time that the physical sciences were also established within European universities encouraged the adoption of a common academic language of investigation. So the study of history, for example, had a brand new range of tools and methods and Altertumswissenschaft the science of history as Wolff had originally described as philological investigations, became a common project of many university departments, that same project that Ulrich von Wilhelmowitz Moeandorf would later describe as the conquest of the past by scholarship. After that of Göttingen, the university at Berlin, presently, the Humboldt University of Berlin, had been a major mover in the astonishing processes of partitioning new areas of study into different academic disciplines. The primary university first of Prussia and later of the Kingdom of Germany, Berlin's university had been established in the first decade of the 19th century as the pinnacle of Alexander von Humboldt's visionary notion of an education system for the entire Prussian population, a system which operated as a meritocracy and was designed to inculcate the values of that highly structured, highly autocratic state, set amidst the wide well-ordered avenues of a city that, in the 1890s had reminded Mark Twain of Chicago. Berlin's university was directly financed by the state, projects such as Ehrman's Dictionary being funded by a specially appointed state commission. Many of its professors, too, were powerful parliamentary and courtly presences, and all of them shared the same stern work ethic, a strong sense of a fundamental order in civilized human society, a fierce belief in the logical processes and progress of science, philology and history, and a powerful loyalty both to their academic disciplines and to the university in which they passed their lives. It was, in short, a unique academic culture, its hierarchies and its learning methods generating a monk-like dedication to study that even in its own time was known as culture Protestantismus, cultural Protestantism. Grammars and dictionaries. Born in 1854, Professor Adolf Ehrman had played only a late role in the construction of Germany's remarkable academic machine, but one in which modern perceptions of ancient Egypt would be transformed. For Ehrman, who had been born into that high academic culture, it was a most necessary transformation for Egyptology, which though popular amongst the general public had not benefited from the rapid philological developments that had taken place in the study of other ancient languages. So, at the beginning of his career, Ehrman had found that his fellow academics regarded his chosen subject as lacking in full academic rigor in its translations of the ancient texts and its accounts of pharaonic history somewhat fanciful. Ehrman changed all that. In the 1870s, whilst yet in his 20s and working as an assistant to Lepsius, who was himself refused a teaching post at Berlin's University on the grounds that Egyptology was not required, he was employing the methodologies of classical philology and the advancing science of linguistics to analyze the grammar of hieroglyphic texts and beginning to publish a brilliant stream of technical articles upon the subject. At this point, he later recalled, the relative isolation of ancient Egyptian from the study of other ancient languages had been an asset to him, for he was able to construct an individual methodology for a subject based entirely on pharaonic texts and the syntax of classical philology. A single essential perception lay behind the process by which Ehrman transformed contemporary Western views of ancient Egypt, and he employed it from the beginning of his work. This was that the key to the deeper understanding of the hieroglyphic language, which had been employed over several millennia and whose ultimate expression had been written in Coptic Greek, lay in isolating, comparing and describing its various phases as they had developed through time. Ehrman started by dividing the history of the language into successive stages in the same way that other academics had long since divided other languages. Broadly speaking, Ehrman's bipartite linguistic division corresponding to Bunsen's tripartition of pharaonic history, Ehrman's Old Egyptian being the written language of Bunsen's Old and Middle Kingdoms, with Ehrman's so-called Later Egyptian appearing during the New Kingdoms. Later phases. In 1880, Ehrman, a neat bespectacled young man of 26, published his New Egyptian Grammatic, a business-like grammar of Later Egyptian. 9 years later, his prodigious command both of the development of the ancient language and of the ancient scribes' calligraphy enabled him to produce Die Sprache des Papyrus Westcar, a grammatical analysis of that papyrus fairy stories, as Ehrman called them, about Hardiev, the magician Jedi and the priest's wife who had given birth to kings. Ehrman had discovered the unique document, unrolled but yet unpublished amongst Lepsius' papers, for its translation had eluded all earlier scholars. Just a few years later, in 1894, Ehrman published a more comprehensive grammar, Egyptische Grammatik, in which he employed examples of texts from various periods of pharaonic history and showed how the grammar of the written language had developed through time. And for his main source of Old Egyptian he used the pyramid texts, his lucid translations made just a decade after Brugsch's first faltering attempts to copy and decipher them. Ehrman's studies rendered all earlier grammars obsolete. In everything from his method of transcribing hieroglyphs into the Latin alphabet which he developed from contemporary Semitic studies, to the very elements of grammar that he described, the novelty of Ehrman's work was such that his American translator had to invent English equivalents for some of his technical terms. Almost single-handedly, he had created the foundations of modern Egyptology and made Berlin the world center of its study. It is said that whilst working on his Egyptische Grammatik, Ehrman had contacted Maspero, asking for a fresh copy to be made of a passage of the pyramid texts whose impressions were held on Mariette's paper squeezes which were kept in Paris. What a pity, Ehrman is reported to have said upon receiving the corrected text from his Parisian colleague, that even at this early period the Egyptians could not write correctly. What a pity, Maspero is said to have remarked on hearing Ehrman's comments, that the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom had not read him Ehrman's grammar. It was not arrogance, Gardner later observed, that led to a split in Egyptology between those trained in the methods of the Berlin School, and many other Egyptologists of the day, most notably those of the French and British universities and museums. It was simply the Berliners' habit of disregarding the work of any except those of their own persuasion, an attitude that was largely due to the rigorous methods of the Berlin School, which had replaced the individual, often haphazard, intuitions of earlier interpreters. At Berlin, Egyptology was considered to be science, its study a definitive project to be undertaken by generations of researchers who would advance the subject stage by stage, so that a great text-based source of knowledge would represent in logical and documented detail all aspects of the ancient civilization. By 1897, the core activity of this extraordinary enterprise was the compilation of Ehrman's hieroglyphic dictionary, which entailed the copying, translation and listing of the words and phrases on the texts upon the standing monuments of Egypt and those held in the world's museums. It was a precise and hugely time-consuming undertaking, yet one that found a willing and expert staff. For since the publication of Ehrman's grammar books, Egyptologists such as Gardner were traveling from all over Europe and America to study at Berlin, and as the best young talents of the day studied the newly created science of Egyptology. With its inventor, they were put to work upon the compilation of the Wörterbuch, as the Berlin Hieroglyphic Dictionary has come to be affectionately known. In broad terms, a group of German and Austrian scholars were set to copying the ancient texts in Egypt and those held in Great Britain, whilst Kurt Sethe, the closest of Ehrman's academic colleagues and his one-time student, worked upon the pyramid texts, and James Henry Breasted, a talented American student who had published an English translation of Ehrman's Egyptische Grammatik in the year of its German publication, traveled to museums of Europe copying the texts in those collections. Gardner had joined the Wörterbuch staff a few years after Breasted. Never one of Ehrman's students in class in the strict terminology of Berlin academia as a junior associate, he spent much time in the museums of Leiden and Turin, where he transcribed many of the papyri that Champollion had unrolled almost a century before, rendering those calligraphic texts into lines of neatly written hieroglyphs. A pioneering labor following upon Ehrman's translation of Papyrus Westcar. Gardner's work on those papyri widened the dictionary's scope so that it included a considerable body of handwritten ancient documents rather than just the monumental inscriptions on wood and stone that most of his co-workers were engaged in copying, aided by dozens of fellow researchers in other German universities. This enormous lexicographical enterprise eventually produced 1,200,000 individual slips of paper, each one of which held some 30 words or sewing blocks of hieroglyphs, most of which had been analyzed and translated under the critical eye of Ehrman and some other senior editors. Filed and numbered in extensive catalogues, every word on every slip was then cross-referenced so that its every known occurrence was indexed and listed. This it was that formed the basis of the Berlin Dictionary, a dictionary that, in the manner of the Oxford English Dictionary, defines each word by quotation and thus traces its development and changes throughout 3 millennia. Issued in various forms from the early 1920s, though with the products of that research already present in the works of many scholars long before the First World War, it was and yet remains a remarkable accomplishment. At the same time, however, it employed Philologiae's principal virtue of scientific accuracy to quietly set the attitudes and opinions of the Berlin School, specifically those of Professor Ehrman and the German academics of his day, into the modern vision of ancient Egypt. And as one might expect, these were the products of their time and place, the earlier vision of Winckelmann and Humboldt allied to the political currents of late 19th century Germany, which were all perfectly encapsulated by Ehrman in 1886 in the preface to his Life in Ancient Egypt, the widely influential work that introduced the new-made ancient Egypt of the BerlinSeminars to the Western world. Ancient records, modern histories. Though Gardner came to dislike the exclusivity of the Berlin School, its powerful values and extraordinary work ethic had resonated strongly with the hardworking young American James Henry Breasted, who hailed from the not dissimilar background of contemporary Midwestern Congregationalism. Those stern principles, doubtless allied to the fact that the public education system in America had been largely modeled upon that of Prussia's, had given the University of Berlin, the high temple of that academic order, a special aura in the young man's eyes, and indeed had led him to Professor Ehrman's seminar. As a student in Berlin, Breasted had transcribed large numbers of hieroglyphic inscriptions for their inclusion in the Wörterbuch, combined with extra field work in Egypt and the European museums. A decade later he employed those same materials for his Ancient Records of Egypt, a remarkable 5-volume epic of translation covering 2,500 years of pharaonic documents which for the best part of the 20th century served as standard English versions of most ancient Egyptian historical texts. In those same years too, following his appointment as the first professor of Egyptology in America, Breasted mined those texts for his majestic A History of Egypt which first appeared in 1906. Along with his Ancient Records, this too served as a standard general history of ancient Egypt for generations of historians, written in lively and authoritative prose, in its preoccupation with politics and economics, in its judgments and in its characterizations, consciously or unconsciously. Most modern histories still follow Breasted's impressive narratives. A decade later, Breasted published the first of 2 works on the development of ancient Egyptian religion, both of which took as their starting points views that had been argued over and discussed in the Berlin Seminar before the First World War, indeed, the first and most influential of those volumes, The Development of Religion and Thought in Ancient Egypt, is dedicated with gratitude and affection to Professor Ehrman, who, as one of Ehrman's eminent contemporaries had previously remarked, had been the first to present the Egyptian religion in historical perspective. Described as a classic and a monument of scholarship, Breasted's first volume on ancient Egyptian religion has had almost as large an impact on the modern visions of ancient Egypt as his historical works. And they share the same central themes, for all of them recount the history of ancient Egypt as a narrative of ethical and material progress. His second volume on religion, for example, describes a millennial journey from savagery through barbarism to decadence and dissolution, a journey that, for both Breasted and Northern Europeans such as Ehrman, echoed a pessimistic vision of the history of ancient religion as a progress from paganism to high church decadence that, lacking the saving grace of Protestant Christianity, must lead inevitably to decay and dissolution. Just as Ehrman's earlier popular books had introduced ancient Egypt to generations of German speakers, so Breasted's writings, more than those of any other single individual, have transmitted Berlin's attitudes to ancient Egyptian history and culture to the English-speaking world, a connection generously acknowledged by Breasted's pious Maecenas, John D. Rockefeller, who would finance the publication of Ehrman's Wörterbuch in Berlin during that city's poverty-stricken decades after the First World War. In similar fashion, following its first appearance in 1927, Gardner's Egyptian grammar became the crib of successive generations of Egyptological students around the world, echoing the shorter volumes of Ehrman's earlier grammars in both its structure and even in its typographic layout, setting the study of hieroglyphic writing firmly, as had Ehrman, within the pages of a classical grammar. Gardner's grammar, as it is affectionately known, offered and yet still offers students the old epigraphic promise of the conquest of the past by scholarship, just as Friedrich August Wolff had laid down at Göttingen more than a century before, and as Ehrman and Sethe had taught at Berlin. The past and the progress of ancient history would be revealed by following the seductive discipline and methodologies of traditional classical philology, as Gardiner reaffirmed in his biographical essay of 1961. 19. Interpreting the Pyramids. Kurt Sethe and the Pyramid Texts. Alongside his work on the Berlin Dictionary, one of Sethe's considerable contributions to Egyptology and a labor that engaged him over the best part of his life was an edition and hand-copied hieroglyphs, translations, and commentary of all of the then-known texts that were engraved in pyramids. From the first part of this work, which appeared in 1908, to the last, which was posthumously published with Gardiner's help in 1962, Sethe's edition has underpinned virtually all discussion of the pyramids texts. It had been Sethe, indeed, who first named those texts collectively, Pyramid and Pyramid texts. In Maspero's lay inscriptions de Pyramide de Saqqara, each separate verse of the Pyramids text had been accompanied by a translation and an explanation of their meaning based on Maspero's understanding of the funerary texts of later ages, for there was nothing else with which those earliest of such documents could be compared. Given their inscrutable nature, it was a subtle work, but one that, as Maspero himself readily acknowledged, was largely based on intuition founded upon a long immersion in modern studies of ancient Egypt and its religion. Maspero's publication set the long column texts of engraved hieroglyphs into the cold hard forms of a letterpress hieroglyphic font, and abandoned the vertical columns of the ancient originals as Sethe would later do, arranging them in horizontal lines, in the manner of Western writing, from left to right. In similar fashion, though the ancient texts give no indication of a fixed order in which they were intended to be read, both Maspero and Sethe began their editions of the pyramids ancient verses with the lists of offerings inscribed on the north wall of the pyramid's burial chambers before moving outwards towards the pyramid's entrances, ordering the texts as they had been placed on successive corridors and chambers. Sethe also followed Maspero in basing his edition on the texts in Venus Pyramid, which were and still are the oldest known and best preserved examples of them all, covering but limited parts of the pyramid's interior architecture. They give the impression of being the primary version, the editio princeps, of the longer sets of texts in later pyramids. There, however, the similarity between the two versions stopped, for Sethe's methods of analysis and explanation were based upon the analytical methods of 19th century German classical and biblical scholarship, such borrowings being neatly underlined by his adoption of the term Sprüche-Proverbs as the name for the text's different verses. Sethe also set the verses of the text in a numbered order, following the order of his presentation, from burial chamber to doorway, a system that had originally been devised by another of the BerlinSeminars Egyptological collaborators, Count Hans Schackenberg, and one that is still widely used today, and in the manner of Göttingen's classical seminars, whose primary aim was the analysis of differing and often damaged versions of a single text in order to establish an earlier theoretical, lost original. Sethe placed differing versions of the various verses from all of the then-known pyramids, one after another within his numerical sequence, adding newfound verses as they were discovered, under new numbers at the ending of his list, a process that has continued to this day as hundreds of new verses, along with variants of well-known older ones, have been found in newly excavated pyramids. Coupled with the leap in understanding of the ancient language forged in the BerlinSeminars, the accuracy and linguistic perception of Sethe's studies of the pyramid texts gave us copies, translations and commentaries a level of coherence beyond all previous imagining. Such was the force of this accomplishment, indeed, that it was only in 1968 that the text of a single pyramid, those of Venus, once again, were published and translated as a separate entity in their own right. Yet the transference of those dark columns of engravings from the walls of pyramids into the order processes of a European seminar had a profound effect upon their modern understanding. Indexed and cross-referenced, analyzed and ordered line by line as they had never been before. The effect of Sethe's pyramid and texan was that the modern world now read those ancient verses as if they were passages in books. 1. Effect was to encourage a search for some joining narrative within the numbered verses. Another was the employment of the pyramid text as an esoteric encyclopedia from whose capacious indices odd lines could be extracted like plums from a pudding, an explanation of everything ancient Egyptian, from the sacredness of grasshoppers to the use of colored stone and temple architecture. Another effect was that in analyzing the pyramid texts in the manners and method of classical and Bible scholarship, they were often assumed to be filled with metaphors and symbolisms. Unlike true metaphors or symbols, however, whose very purposes are ambivalent and whose meanings shift and change. The images in the pyramid texts were considered to be sets of ciphers, which had encoded simple and straightforward beliefs. Breasteds. Commentaries, for example, assume that selected passages could serve as guides to an understanding of the genesis of Western moral and ethical behavior. Others, alternatively, imagine that they hold myths to explain the origins and constitution of the universe, whilst others yet again consider them to be descriptions of the rituals performed at royal funerals, somewhat in the manner of the Book of Common Prayer. After a century and more of study, all such approaches have gained considerable academic pedigree in a language of their own. Timely meditations. As a professor of classical philology at the University of Bâle, Friedrich Nietzsche had understood the dangers in studying ancient texts in the manner employed by Erman and by Breasted decades before their work began. Written during the 1870s after he had resigned his post at the ending of a bitter controversy, Nietzsche's writings on this subject, a dazzling blast of insult and insight known today as we philologists, are his impassioned valediction to 19th-century German academia. Like countless other Europeans of his time, Nietzsche held an overwhelming vision of classical antiquity, derived from Winckelmann and Goethe, as an age of profound accomplishment. Nietzsche's conception of classical Greece, however, differed from that of his contemporaries, who considered that the social harmony and artistic accomplishments of Winckelmann's ancient Greece could be revisited with the aid of strong government and a classical education in that thus equipped, industrial Europe, and more especially the German nation, could retain those antique levels of perfection. Nietzsche's view was that the urban culture of classical Greece had been the absolute antithesis of contemporary European society. The better the state is organized, he declared, with an eye towards the city of Berlin, which had recently become the immaculate capital of the newly founded German Empire, the duller humanity will be. Nietzsche, therefore, considered that the academic professors of philology, the gatekeepers of antiquity, had grossly misinterpreted the ancient writings and were guilty of providing false visions of the classical past and thus of providing the modern world with dangerous aspirations. Nietzsche's classical antiquity, alternatively, was a fierce free thing that could never be encompassed by other members of his one-time profession whom, he observed, had more affection for study and academic life than for the realities of the past, and whose vision of ancient history was tempered by shallow rationalism and a timid submission typical of state-funded professionals. Though the historical detail of Nietzsche's arguments have been superseded, the fundamental question posed by his diatribe are valid to this day. How should the past be viewed? Does philology hold a genuine scientific key to its understanding? Are philology and history even sciences? Does the 19th century division of ancient societies into epigraphic, economic, cultural, religious and political components aid or hinder our understanding of the ancient past? Can such approaches ever provide the reason why those lines of cattle waiting patiently to be slaughtered have been assembled amidst the dust at Abusir? Can they place those massive living presences, those solid shadowed animals, standing amidst clouds of incense in the stench of blood and dung, as acts of offering and provision, and relate them to the making of flint. Slaughtering knives, to the construction of temples and fine statues. 2. Pyramids and river barges, to the identification of the pharaoh as the bull of his own mother. Nietzsche was especially critical of a method common amongst other academics of his century that defined and isolated certain elements in ancient societies as religious within a Christian meaning of that word, a method espoused by both Champollion and the Berlin School. With no proof whatsoever, Nietzsche observed, such an attitude assumes that an awareness of the divine and an innate need to worship had been a constant factor throughout all human history. What if, he proposed, morality was not based on religion, that there were no priests of religion, no guild of priests, no holy writ in all antiquity, only priests of the individual gods. The bones of the Hell-Hounds Tremble, Primitivism, and the BerlinSeminars christened the cannibal hymn in the early years of the last century. The pyramid text that Sethe numbered 393 to 414 hold but one of the multifarious descriptions of the events that follow the death and rebirth of Pharaoh. In common with many other verses, they tell of the dead king's journey to join the populations that inhabit the unseen world, which here is presented as the night sky of the lower Nile, and concludes with Pharaoh's establishment as a star shining as lord of the horizon, alongside the other gods. That the progress of this cosmic transfiguration is told in terms of slaughtering, cooking and eating several of the gods marks the cannibal hymn as unique amongst known pyramid texts. Nor was it greatly favored by the ancient scribes, for after its inscription within Venus pyramid it only appeared once again, in the pyramid of his successor, Teddy. Bresson thought that the unusual violence of its imagery was a picture of grotesque cannibalism. The gods are hunted down, lassoed, bound, and slaughtered like wild cattle, and he explained his presence amongst the other texts that describe the same migration and more prayerful or liturgic tones as surviving from vastly remote prehistoric days, in which we see the savage pharaoh ferociously preying upon the gods like a bloodthirsty hunter in the jungle. Modern explanations of the cannibal hymn, alternatively, consider its fierce imagery to have been based upon an account of the slaughtering, butchering, cooking and eating of a sacrificial bull. That one of its verses describes Venus as the bull of the sky that is, as a dead king who has been translated to the unseen world in the form of a bull, equates the act of ritual slaughter with the death and, ultimately, the regeneration of the king, and that in turn shows those verses to be a variant of the circular narratives that are central to funerary texts of all periods of pharaonic history, which deal with the awkward physical problem posed by the recurring acts of spontaneous regeneration from life to death that took place continuously in the pharaonic universe in concert with the rhythms of the year. Another near-contemporary version of that same theme, and one that involved powerful physical contact between the unseen and the visible living world, was the slaughtering of bulls and other living offerings in the temples of Abusir, acts conducted in the royal name that crossed the boundaries of the visible living world whilst at the same time serving to nourish both the living and the dead. A later variant on the same circular theme describes Pharaoh regenerating by an act of masturbation, another as the bull of his mother, the common latter notion of incest as a means of self-procreation being present in an abbreviated form in the pyramid text account of similar acts amongst the family of state gods. The key to this multi-layered reinterpretation of the cannibal hymn lies in the identification of King Venus as the bull of the sky that appears in a section of the text that Bresson did not include in his translation as he considered it to be exceptionally obscure. The problem did not lie in Bresson's command of the ancient language, for he was a considerable philologist, but rather, as Gardner commented in a near-contemporary study of a similarly ambiguous document, in the translator's attitude to the text itself, the only basis we can have for preferring one rendering to another, when once the exigencies of Grammar and dictionary have been satisfied and these leave a large margin for divergencies, is an intuitive appreciation of the trend of the ancient writer's mind. Intent on cannibalism, therefore, all that breasted could discern in that verse was that it contains an important statement. That the king lives on the being of every god, eating their organs who come with their belly filled with charms. Why cannibalism? Like his fellow members of the BerlinSeminars, Breasted considered the people of the Old Kingdom to have been primitive and assumed that the ancient Egyptians of later eras had inherited their savage ways. As Ehrman himself wrote in 1904, in an introduction to a handbook about ancient Egyptian religion for the Berlin Imperial Museums, Ehrman's judgment was made on a philological basis at a time when few Old Kingdom texts other than the pyramid texts had been translated and its arts and architecture were still little known. In consequence, that vastly complex period was considered to have been semi-literate and hence a primitive and largely a historic era. Until 1890, indeed, in the publication of Ehrman's pioneering translation of the Papyrus Westcar, with its tales of Prince Hardiedeff and the Regal twins, the same view of the Old Kingdom as a semi-literate and deeply primitive culture had extended to the Middle Kingdom, which is the era in which that remarkable papyrus is believed to have been composed. New Kingdom texts, in contrast, were relatively plentiful in the 19th century, and many of them could be conveniently studied in Champollion's old hunting grounds of the European museums and the tombs and temples of Egyptian Thebes. So, in a brief outline of Egyptian history published in 1894, Ehrman deals with all the earlier periods of pharaonic history in a few pages but had sufficient New Kingdom literary material at his disposal to provide a reign-by-reign account of a succession of some New Kingdom pharaohs, narratives he largely tells in 19th century terms of war and conquest. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that he characterized the New Kingdom as a prosperous and splendid age which had arisen out of darkness. The unfortunate image of Breasted's enjungled pharaoh was born of that same understanding of the primitive which had been seasoned by contemporary descriptions of some of the sub-Saharan cultures that Westerners were encountering during the so-called scramble for Africa. For the African rites and rituals that the colonizers were witnessing seemed so removed from their previous experience that they assumed their celebrants to be irrational and ferocious and could hardly distinguish reality from magic and superstition, a primitive state, the missionaries claimed, that also resulted in the lamentable social and moral order which they perceived within those societies. To many scholars of the time, such cultures appeared to be living examples of the reality of early pharaonic culture.